Okay, hello.
Hello.
On today's episode of Kezcast, we are debating who is really responsible for Duncan's murder in Macbeth. Let's go.
Okay, so I will be taking the side of Macbeth and saying how he is ultimately responsible.
And I will be taking the side of Lady Macbeth and trying to convince you that she is responsible for the murder of Duncan.
I mean, first, straight off the bat, you are at least justifiably wrong because Macbeth was the one who plunged the knife into Duncan, so criminally he would be charged with that, and that would be murder. So technically he is already responsible.
Sure, in English criminal law, Macbeth would be charged with the murder of Duncan. However, we've got to think about if he would actually have done it if Lady Macbeth had not existed. Because primarily, in
It's okay, we're just searching for a quote. We're searching for a scene.
The textbook.
Come on, Nathaniel.
I
Thought
see,
you'd be better prepared than this.
In Act 1, Scene 7, Macbeth ultimately decides in his first soliloquy that he will not kill Duncan because he sees that he has certain responsibilities to the king and he's honour bound to the king as his kinsman, his subject, and as his host, not to kill him.
But we see, that's after maybe some thought, but we can see in his inherent desire that in Act 1, Scene 3, he says that the great Glamis and Thane of Cawdor, the greatest is behind. What he's saying is that two of the witches' prophecies are behind him, but that still leaves one in front, and it's in my belief that Macbeth won't be contented until the crown is upon his head. So, yeah, I think that after maybe a battle, an internal struggle between his good and his evil side, I think that the good does come through, but overall, obviously, the evil will conquer that, I think.
At the start of the play, that's utterly wrong because, I mean, Macbeth, well, the first thing he says upon learning of the prophecy is, if fate will have me king, chance fate will crown me.
Where is that?
This is, I'm not actually sure where this quote is.
Oh,
It's in Act 1.
It's made up.
And,
is that what you're saying?
This means that he sees that fate has already made him Thane of Cawdor instantly. So he says, well, if I leave it up to fate, then fate will surely make me king as well. Which means he doesn't really want to kill Duncan. He's just leaving it up to fortune to take its path, destiny to choose him as king.
And yet, straight after that, he says, my thought whose murder yet is but fantastical. So he immediately he knows that he will ultimately become king. As he says in Act 1, Scene 5, he thinks that the witch's prophecy is true. He thinks that they are telling the truth. He could just let nature take its course, but I believe that immediately he realises that the only way he will get the crown is to murder Duncan. And in Act 1, Scene 3, Duncan's murder is fantastical at that point, but then it begins to build in his mind. It begins to become a scheme, so to speak, a plot, if you will.
Okay, very well. This still does not address the point that he ultimately decides not to kill Duncan. And we have to see that Lady Macbeth convinces him to kill Duncan in the end of Act 1, Scene 7. She actually insults his manhood to make him do it. He was never going to do it in the first place. He had decided not to. And then she tells him that he is not a man. And he says, well, I have to kill him. I have to follow my wife's orders.
But if a part of Macbeth didn't want to do it, he wouldn't do it. We see him overrule her several times in the play, in the earlier acts. So if he didn't want to do it, if there wasn't a part of him that wanted this, he would have just said no. He would have stopped. As in Jacobean times, we see that the man is the more dominant figure in the relationship. So he would have just overruled her, as was his right at that time, in that period. I mean, your point is that the murder wouldn't happen without Lady Macbeth, but I could also claim that the murder wouldn't happen without Macbeth, because Lady Macbeth says in Act 2, Scene 2, lines 12 to 13, that she could not have carried out the murder because Duncan resembled her father too much. So it wouldn't happen without Lady Macbeth either. However, I believe that although ultimately the murder wouldn't happen without both, I still believe that Macbeth is more culpable than Lady
Saying
Macbeth.
that Macbeth is the more dominant partner in the marriage. He's ignoring one of the key traits of Lady Macbeth, in that she is incredibly manipulative, domineering, and just evil, fully evil. It's absolutely just repulsive at parts of the play. It really is. And
I can see that.
whereas Macbeth has loyalty to the king, which is what means that he decides not to do it in his soliloquy in Act 1, Scene 7. Lady Macbeth has no loyalty to anyone. Macbeth sees Duncan as a friend, and he's also a subject. Whereas Lady Macbeth, she wants nothing else other than for Macbeth to be king and her to be queen, most importantly. She has no moral codes. She doesn't have any system of honour that Macbeth rules his life by as a warrior. She is simply evil.
You see, you speak of that code of honour, and what you're saying is that if he were to go through the murder, Lady Macbeth would become queen. She wouldn't rule by a code of honour, but after the murder, we see that Macbeth is actually the one to rule without a code of honour, as he callously kills his best friend and orders the execution of his best friend's son in Act 3, Scene 1. And furthermore, he goes on to order the murder and execution of Macduff, his believed rival, his whole family, and his whole estate, including young children and his wife. All of it razed to the ground. So we see that Macbeth, although at the start of the play, we see him as a noble thane who does operate by an honourable code. By the end of the play, he's a regicidal, murderous tyrant. And I think that this side of him has always been present. I think that, yes, it was suppressed at first by sort of his good side, his noble side. I think that it comes out after the murder of Duncan, and he becomes what he truly is. He sort of inhabits.
What we see there is just the corrupting effect that the detestable temptress Lady Macbeth has on Macbeth. That's all we're seeing there. It's not part of Macbeth's character trait that he would always have turned out as a tyrant. It's part of the corrupting influence of Lady Macbeth has on him as the sole root of Macbeth's evil, if you like.
See, I would argue that instead of her converting his character to something that it isn't, it's her waking up something that's been dormant within him. She awakes his evil side that has always been there, and he sort of embraces it. He comes to realise that that's what he truly is, and that's why he doesn't care about the murders of his best friend, his best friend's son, and Macduff's family. He doesn't care. And I think that's...
But he does.
He's
Deeply affected by the murder of Duncan. For example, he says that he won't sleep again. He's deeply guilty. He claims that he has murdered sleep. Whereas Lady Macbeth, she seems unaffected. She fakes a faint to draw attention off Macbeth's awful lies. She just seems completely callous and unaffected in any way, shape or form.
But by the end, she's...
Yeah,
I would say, however...
Does she seem
she's
unaffected?
guilty.
Or is she just hiding that to try and put up a front to
She
try
goes
and
mad at the
inspire
end.
her?
That's true,
Yeah.
but I would say that's an effect of the pent-up evil and corruption in her very soul that makes her go mad. I wouldn't say it's a result of guilt. She shows no guilt for the
Then what about the blood on her hands and
Yeah,
out down the
exactly.
spot? Is that...
The hallucinations that she uses to try and soften the blow that is his death on her morality. How can you argue that? I mean, I would say that Macbeth isn't affected by guilt, but by selfish desire. He is concerned by the fact that he can't say amen. And that is purely down to the fact that he is concerned about the fact
That demonstrates
that
how
he's been damned.
that Antichrist figure of Lady Macbeth has stopped him from reaching God. That's what that shows. That doesn't demonstrate anything.
No,
guys.
what I think it demonstrates is his selfish desire. He wants to be king, and he also wants to go to heaven. These two parts of him, within him, are sort of battling, an internal battle, if you will. And what I see this as is a selfish sort of act, selfish desire, that even though he's aware that he's committed a sin, a horrible crime, he still is scared of damnation. He's still scared of going to hell. I don't think it's regret at all. I think it's fear.
Can I throw a question out there? What influence do you think the witches have on Macbeth's decision? What influence would they have? Because you could argue, well, I mean, I'll let you argue the point, but it could go either way.
The witches forecast that he was Thane of Glamis, then they'd say he'd become Thane of Cawdor, and then they'd say he'd become king. Now, obviously, the witches, I would argue, he was always going to become Thane of Cawdor after the Thane of Cawdor's treachery. Duncan would have always, I think, bestowed that title upon Macbeth, and then the next natural route would have been kingship. I would argue that perhaps Macbeth wouldn't have jumped to that quite so quickly. Perhaps he wouldn't have acted as rashly as he did. Maybe he would have waited. Maybe he would have bided his time. And perhaps by natural conclusion, ultimately he would become king. But I think the witches definitely sped up what would have been a lengthy process, and I think they are definitely culpable, but still, in my mind, Macbeth is the lead.
I don't think you give the witches enough credit because I don't think Macbeth held any notions of becoming king prior to the witch's prophecy at all. He's just described as a brave lieutenant of Duncan, a brave general, nothing more. And he serves as king nobly and honourably on the battlefield, whereas after the prophecy, that's when he first realises. Therefore, I think the witches are the first people to bestow that notion in his head. There was no prior notion of becoming king in Macbeth.
I mean, that's quite difficult to argue because we don't know whether that will be the next step. I think that he's always, obviously, Lady Macbeth highlights the fact that he's always had ambition in him. He has inherent ambition. So I think that perhaps after Thane of Cawdor, his ambition might have, lit the title might have lit a spark in his head, and then that might have sort of spiraled. It's hard to say that he would ultimately want to become king. It's hard to say that he would then follow through with the murder of Duncan without the witches. But I think it's definitely arguable that it's plausible that without the witches' involvement, he still would have reached the end goal. I think that's fair to say.
That is fair to say. But
Is there anybody other than Macbeth, Lady Macbeth, and the witches? Is there anybody else that might be responsible?
I mean, maybe destiny. Maybe it was always meant to happen.
Yeah,
It's hard to say.
that could be true. I mean, maybe this was Macbeth's destiny to begin with. Maybe he would have sought this, and the witches only foresaw it. They only told him of his destiny. Maybe. I mean, this comes down to free will, which is also another big theme in the play. Depends whether.
Maybe the witches are a figment of his imagination. Maybe
Yeah,
he's an
maybe.
unreliable narrator. For example, we see that happen in the banquet scene. No one else sees the ghost of Banquo.
That's
it
true.
could not be there at all. It could be the same with the witches. Although we know Banquo saw the witches, what happens to Banquo? He dies like almost immediately after by Macbeth's hand.
So you could argue that all of what happens in the play is predestined, and the witches only tell him, or maybe
From
it's fate playing a part.
like from a meta-theatrical sense, like
Oh, yes.
it's a play, it's been written. Macbeth is a character
Yeah, exactly.
completely at the hands of Shakespeare. It has all been rewritten. It was always going to end this way.
It was always going to. I mean, you don't start the play with the witches. You start the play with the murder of Duncan. You sort of work your way. That's how I reckon. That's how Shakespeare would have done it. He worked his way backwards. The end goal is the fact that Macbeth kills Duncan to become king, and then it's sort of orchestrating that. And then, so yeah, arguably it's predestined by the playwright. So that's apt.
So you think the murder of Duncan would have happened even without the witch's involvement?
I think it's definitely plausible. It's arguable, definitely, because, I mean, as I said, Lady Macbeth has highlighted the fact that her husband possesses ambition.
I mean, it depends if you believe in free will, which is...
Yeah.
And not
one of the
whole-
main
Oh,
themes
Do
of
we
the
have
play.
any proof that Macbeth would have actually done something with his ambition? Because there are many scenes and many soliloquies of Macbeth where he's sort of tossing the ideas over and
Yeah.
saying, what do I do, what do I do?
So he's got like this internal struggle, this internal monologue within him. Which as I said previously, it's sort of the argument between good and evil within Macbeth, which he definitely possesses. He definitely has those two sides to him. So whether when he became Thane of Cawdor, whether the next step in his mind was kingship, and then sort of from there, how do I achieve that? Because Duncan says Malcolm will be king next. Obviously, Macbeth thought it was him, because initially that was what Macbeth was hoping. He was hoping that. Duncan would immediately go, well, you're next to be in line of throne. And then I think if Duncan had done that, I don't think the murder would have taken place. I think Macbeth would have waited because Duncan is old, as it says in the play. But as soon as he sort of said, Malcolm, you're next, I think that's when the evil side sort of overcame the good within Macbeth, and he decided that this was the only way he would become king. This is what he was going to do.
Do you think that Macbeth's sort of, well, going back to the witches just for a minute, do you think that Macbeth's sort of malleability might play a part in having committed the murder? Because, again, this could go to the witches or to Lady Macbeth saying, again, like Nat's been saying, evil temptress, manipulator Lady Macbeth.
True.
Do you reckon that sort of Macbeth's character himself is just sort of, it's his own downfall, really? Do you reckon?
Is there anything that he actively decides on in the play that's like completely down to his agency and not the influence of others?
He does decide on the murder of Banquo because Lady Macbeth at the banquet, she asks... she doesn't. He doesn't tell her, which I think shows some kind of internal struggle
He
between
does.
the two.
I think he does. He doesn't tell her about murdering Macduff and all of his family
Because
because he thinks that she is too mentally unstable at that point in the play. So he does have
But-
agency in doing that.
but he definitely ordered the murder of Banquo without consulting his wife. He definitely decided on that himself. He saw Banquo sort of putting the pieces together in his head. How Macbeth. He was there when the prophecy was given, so he's aware that these cogs in Macbeth's head are all turning, and then he sort of puts together that Macbeth was the murderer. And I think then Macbeth just acts rashly, because perhaps Banquo would have joined him. It's hard to say. We don't know. But what we do know is the fact that he did order the murder of Banquo without Lady Macbeth's input. So it's arguable that he is, although he's malleable, he definitely has some kind of backbone to him.
Yeah, he's not. He doesn't disagree with taking human life. I
No.
think.
I think the real tragedy of the play is that he didn't need to kill Duncan to become king, because Duncan wasn't the threat standing in the way of him becoming king. It was Duncan's son Malcolm who was becoming.
That's
So
very
by
true.
killing Duncan, all he did was illegitimize his claim to the throne. He should have killed Malcolm. If I was going to make a suggestion, he should have killed Malcolm.
Alternate universe, Macbeth.
No,
And then made it
I
like
definitely
accident,
agree.
of course.
Yeah, I mean, what it comes down to ultimately is, I think what we've sort of discovered just through other debate is the fact that it's Macbeth's fault, it's Lady Macbeth's fault, and it's the witch's fault. Those three are culpable. I think
there's no one definite.
I would
It's
agree.
your fault.
I would say that without any of those three, the murder just simply wouldn't have happened. So I think that whether they are equally culpable is hard to say. That's just down to personal
Is there
interpretation.
like a common sort of denominator in regards to their like qualities, their personalities, that kind of ambition, that
Oh yeah,
power hungry is the true
yeah,
culprit,
exactly.
regardless of person.
Yeah, I mean, maybe not so much in the witches, but they're just inherently evil. They just want to see bloodshed, they want to see suffering,
They
and that's
play to that, don't
They're
they?
the
Exactly.
catalyst.
they're the catalyst to the reaction that is Lady Macbeth and Macbeth, and I think that they're just sheer bloodlust in combination with the two sort of ambitions of Lady Macbeth and Macbeth is what leads to the murder of Duncan. So yeah, I would agree. Ambition is the true murderer of Duncan.
Okay, great. I think that's a great
Yeah.
a great quote to end on. Okay, well done, guys.
Oh,